He said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. Not a street exactly. It was our driveway, which backs up against the Hendersons' yard on one side and the Kowalczyks on the other, and both of them were absolutely outside that morning. Greta Kowalczyk was pulling weeds. The Henderson boy was shooting hoops in his driveway. My husband stood at the front door in his new gym clothes, the ones he'd bought 3 months ago when everything started changing, and he held out a manila envelope like he was presenting me with an award. "I need you to be out in 30 days, he said. "Audrey has already picked out a room for her office." Audrey, his colleague. 38 years old, no kids, drives a Tesla, does hot yoga on Tuesday evenings. I knew everything about her by then, not because he told me, but because when you've been married to someone for 19 years, you notice when they start changing their lock screen password. I didn't say anything. I took the envelope, I held it at my side and looked at him for a long moment, and I must have smiled because he got irritated. "This isn't funny, Joanna." "I know," I said, and I went back inside. I sat at the kitchen table with that envelope in front of me, and I made myself a cup of tea. Earl Grey, the way I always make it. I didn't open the envelope right away. I already knew what was in it. My lawyer had actually warned me it was coming. My husband had filed first, which he apparently thought was some kind of strategic move, the way he thought most things he did lately were strategic moves. He'd been watching a lot of YouTube videos about divorce proceedings. I know because the history was right there on the shared tablet. What he didn't know was what I'd been doing for the past 7 months. I need to back up. We moved to Oakville in 2011. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he still was, legally for another 9 months, had just taken a senior position at an engineering firm in Mississauga, and I was running my small interior design practice out of our home at that point. We found a house on a corner lot, more house than we needed, but we both fell in love with the backyard. A big cedar deck, mature trees, a garden that had clearly been loved by whoever owned it before. We bought it together. My name was on the deed. Then 2 years later, my father passed away and left me a property in Prince Edward County, a farmhouse on 17 acres about 2.5 hours east of us. My father had bought it in the 90s as a retirement project that he never quite got around to, and for years it just sat there generating a modest rental income during tourist season. My husband was never interested in it. Too far, too much work. What are we going to do with a farmhouse, Joanna? So I managed it myself, quietly, the way I managed most things. Over the years, I made improvements, nothing dramatic at first. A new roof, updated plumbing, better insulation. Then my design practice started doing well, and I had some money that was genuinely mine, earned by me, and I kept putting it into that property. I incorporated a numbered company to hold it in 2018, on the advice of my accountant, for liability reasons. Nothing complicated, just good business sense. The property had been generating increasingly serious revenue for 3 years by the time my husband handed me those papers. I had converted the main farmhouse into a high-end short-term rental, the kind that gets booked 18 months in advance by Toronto couples looking for a weekend in wine country, and built 2 smaller guest cottages on the acreage. I'd brought in a property management company out of Picton. The whole thing ran without me needing to be there. My husband knew I had the property. He did not know what it had become. We had not, as he would say, synergized our financial portfolios, his phrase, not mine, and I had never volunteered the details. He'd stopped asking about it years ago. By the time he handed me that envelope, the Prince Edward County property was generating just under $240,000 a year in net rental income. He thought he was removing me from our home. He had no idea what he was removing himself from. I didn't call anyone that morning. I made my tea. I read through the divorce papers. I flagged a few things to discuss with my lawyer. And then I went about my day. I had a client meeting in Burlington at 2 o'clock. A kitchen renovation, lovely couple. They had very specific feelings about the island countertop, and I was not going to let his theater disrupt my schedule. My lawyer's name is Parveen, and she's been practicing family law in the GTA for 22 years. When I called her the next morning, she did not seem particularly alarmed by any of it. "He filed for division of matrimonial property," she said. "That triggers the equalization calculation under the Family Law Act. He'll be entitled to a share of the increase in value of matrimonial assets since the date of marriage. What about the farmhouse? There was a small pause. That's the interesting part. Did your father leave it to you specifically? In a will, yes, my name only. And it was in your name or held through a corporation? My name when I inherited it. I transferred it to a numbered company in 2018. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her writing. Under Ontario's Family Law Act, property you inherit from a family member can be excluded from equalization as long as you haven't converted it into a matrimonial home and kept it traceable. My farmhouse had never been our matrimonial home. We'd never lived there. It had always been an investment property, and I'd been meticulous about keeping the finances completely separate. The rental income flowed through your corporation? Parveen asked. Since 2018, yes. And before that? Into a personal account he didn't have access to. She was quiet for a moment. Joanna, I think you may be in a better position than you realize. I appreciated her saying that, but I already knew. The next few weeks were something I don't love thinking about, not because they were financially scary, but because living in the same house as someone who is simultaneously trying to build a life with someone else is a particular kind of awful that doesn't have a good word for it. He was careful, mostly, polite in a mechanical way like a roommate who's decided to be the bigger person. He started spending Tuesday through Thursday nights at a colleague's in Mississauga, meaning obviously with Audrey, and came home on weekends to keep up some appearance of normalcy that neither of us believed in. His daughter from his first marriage, Lena, called me the second week. She was 26 and lived in Vancouver and had always been kind to me. She was crying on the phone. I don't understand what's happening to him, she said. I think he just got turned around, I said. It was the most honest thing I could say. Audrey keeps posting these. She keeps posting photos with him on her Instagram. She calls him her person. I sat with that for a second. Lena, I need to ask you something. Has your dad talked to you about the finances? About what he expects to get from the house? He told me you'd split everything. He said he was going to buy somewhere with Audrey, that you'd be fine because you have your little property. His little property? I thanked Lena, told her I was okay, told her none of this was her fault, and then I sat in my kitchen in Oakville with my second cup of tea that morning, and I thought carefully about the next step. I want to be clear about something. I was not looking for revenge. I know that's what this kind of story is supposed to be, the wronged wife, the satisfying takedown, and I understand why people frame it that way. But that's not really what I was doing. What I was doing was protecting what I had built. There is a difference. My accountant, his name is Stuart, he has an office in downtown Oakville, and he once refused to bill me for a 40-minute call because, as he said, it was mostly me talking, had been helping me keep the corporate structure clean for 5 years. When I called him to explain the situation, he pulled up my files and spent about 90 seconds reviewing them before he said, "You're fine." Walk me through fine, I said. The numbered company is the registered owner. The company acquired the asset prior to the divorce proceedings. The corporation is not a matrimonial asset. Your shares in the corporation are, but the corporation itself is a separate legal entity, and the property belongs to the corporation. Your husband's lawyers are going to push on this, but your position is legally defensible. How defensible? I'd want Parveen to weigh in, but Joanna, you've done everything right. You've kept clean books. You've paid yourself legitimate dividends that are documented. There's no commingling of personal and corporate funds. This was set up correctly. What this meant, in practical terms, was that my husband was about to ask for his share of a matrimonial estate that included our Oakville house, which, yes, we'd split, and whatever the equalization calculation came out to on our joint investments and his pension, minus mine. What it did not include, or at least what we would argue it should not include, was the Prince Edward County property or the income it had generated. He thought he was getting half of everything. He was getting half of the things he knew about. The formal financial disclosure process was where things got interesting. In Ontario divorce proceedings, both parties have to provide a full financial disclosure, assets, liabilities, income. My husband's lawyer sent over a demand letter. My lawyer sent one back. And then, about 3 weeks later, I got a call from Parveen that I hadn't expected. His lawyer contacted me this morning, she said. They found the numbered company in a public registry search. I felt my stomach tighten just slightly. They're claiming it should be included in the equalization calculation. They're arguing that even though you inherited the property, the increased value of the corporation is a marital asset because you managed it during the marriage. Is that a strong argument? It's an argument. We'll respond. But I want to prepare you, this could go a few different ways. The cleanest resolution is probably a negotiated settlement. What does that look like? They want to include the cottage property in the asset pool. Your husband is arguing its current value, which, based on the appraisal they've requested, will come in at somewhere between 1.8 and 2.2 million, should be subject to equalization. I let that sit for a moment. And what's our counter? We argue the inheritance exclusion. We document the separate finances meticulously. We show that the rental income was never deposited into joint accounts, never used for matrimonial purposes, never intermingled with shared assets. And we point out that the original property was specifically bequeathed to you. How long does this take? If he pushes it to court, 18 months to 3 years. If he settles, it could be done in 4 to 6 months. I asked her to give me a week. I spent that week at the farmhouse, actually. I drove out on a Friday morning, stopped at the Sobeys in Belleville for groceries, and spent the weekend there alone. I walked the property. I sat on the porch of the main farmhouse in the evenings and watched the light change over the fields. I'd had a landscaper clear a walking trail along the creek the previous fall, and I walked it both mornings in the cold in my rubber boots. My father had bought this land because he wanted something quiet and his own. He never quite got to enjoy it the way he intended. I thought about him a lot that weekend. By Sunday evening, I knew what I wanted. I called Parveen on Monday. Tell him I'll settle, I said, on the following terms. The terms were these: he keeps his full pension, which was the largest single asset in his name. I keep the farmhouse corporation without any equalization payment on it. We split the Oakville house equally. His RRSP and my RRSP stay with their respective owners. Any joint non-registered accounts split 50-50. He waives any claim on the business income from the corporation going forward. Parveen said it was a reasonable offer. He might push back on the farmhouse. He might, I said, but remind his lawyer that if this goes to court, we are going to spend the next 2 years arguing the inheritance exclusion, and he is going to spend the next 2 years paying a lawyer to argue against a position that is going to be very hard to win. He can have his pension or he can have a legal bill. She called me 2 days later. They accepted. I won't pretend I felt nothing. I stood in my kitchen in Oakville, the same kitchen where I had stood 1,000 mornings making lunches and reviewing projects and living what I had thought was a real and solid life, and I let myself feel it. The relief, the grief too, because grief doesn't ask permission. 19 years is not nothing, even when they end like this. But underneath both of those things was something steadier, something that had been there for months, building quietly the way things do when you've done the work properly. About 6 weeks after the settlement was signed, I had dinner with my friend Rochelle, who had been my closest friend since we both did the same prenatal yoga class 13 years ago, and discovered we had the same deeply skeptical feelings about the instructor. We went to a place on Lakeshore in Oakville, nothing fancy, a bottle of wine between us, the way we'd done 100 times. He called Lena apparently, Rochelle said, told her the settlement was unfair. She mentioned something. She told him she didn't want to hear it. Rochelle topped up my glass. She told him he should have thought about fair before he went to Audrey. I smiled at that. How are they doing anyway, him and Audrey? Rochelle gave me a particular look. So funny thing, you remember I told you my colleague Fatima knows someone at his firm? Vaguely. Apparently Audrey has been seeing someone else. Has been for a while, actually. Someone in their Vancouver office. She paused. Apparently your husband found out around the same time the settlement was finalized. I held my wine glass and thought about that. That's sad, I said finally. And I meant it genuinely. Not happy sad, just sad. He had turned his life upside down for someone who wasn't who he thought she was, and now he had less of everything, less house, less certainty, less of whatever story he'd been telling himself about what his life was supposed to look like. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired and also strangely free. The farmhouse had its best revenue year ever that summer. I hired a local woman from Picton named Denise to help with the management side, and she turned out to be extraordinary. Organized, practical, genuinely warm with the guests. I drove out every 6 weeks or so, ostensibly to check on things, really just because I'd grown to love it there. I started sketching out plans for a fourth cottage along the northern edge of the property where the trees open up and you can see the lake on a clear day. My design practice picked up too. I'd been pulling back for a few years, prioritizing stability, prioritizing the marriage, prioritizing things that turned out not to need prioritizing. Once I had my life back to myself, I found I had more energy than I'd realized I was sitting on. I sold the Oakville house in October, took my half of the equity, bought a smaller place in Port Hope, close enough to the county to drive out easily, quiet street, good bones, a kitchen that needed work, which I found delightful rather than daunting. My husband is renting a condo in Mississauga. I know because Lena told me, not unkindly, just because we still talk and she wanted me to know she wasn't keeping secrets from me. The Prince Edward County property sits in my numbered company and generates what it generates and belongs entirely to me. My father would have liked that, I think. He was not a sentimental man in words, but he was careful about things that mattered, and he had put my name on that inheritance deliberately, not out of oversight. I think about the morning my husband stood in the driveway sometimes, the manila envelope, the gym clothes, Greta Kowalczyk pulling weeds a few feet away, pretending not to listen. He said it loud enough for the whole street to hear because he wanted witnesses to my humiliation. He wanted people to see the moment he chose something newer and more exciting over something old and settled. What he gave him instead was the moment I smiled and walked back into my house. My house, as it turned out, in more ways than he had any idea. The coffee is good this morning. The property management report from Denise is sitting in my inbox with 3 new 5-star reviews, and outside my kitchen window in Port Hope, the maple is turning the particular red it only gets for about 10 days in October, and I am, without exaggeration, exactly where I want to be. I keep thinking about that driveway moment, the manila envelope, the way he held it out like it meant something about who had power and who didn't. He wasn't entirely wrong that it was a turning point, he just had the direction backwards. I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about what actually protected me, and it wasn't luck, and it wasn't cleverness in some sharp, calculating way. It was something quieter than that. It was years of doing things properly when no one was watching, paying the right accountant, keeping clean books, not commingling funds because my father, who was not a man of many words, had told me once that the most important financial advice he ever received was to keep things separate and document everything. I hadn't followed that advice because I anticipated a divorce. I'd followed it because it was the right way to do things. That's what I think about when people ask me how I won. I don't love that framing, but I understand it. The honest answer is that I didn't win in the moment the papers were handed to me. I won years earlier in small, unglamorous decisions. The decision to incorporate, the decision to keep the rental income in a separate account, the decision to get proper legal advice when I inherited the property instead of just assuming everything would be fine. There's something in that worth sitting with, I think, not as a lesson about divorce strategy. Most people will never need that particular knowledge, but as a lesson about how integrity actually works in a life. You don't build something solid by preparing for catastrophe. You build it by refusing to cut corners when no one would notice if you did. Stuart, my accountant, told me I'd done everything right. What he meant was that I'd done it right long before I needed it to be right. The harder thing to talk about is the grief. Because even when you've protected yourself financially, even when the settlement goes the way it should, you still lost 19 years of a life you built in good faith. My husband made choices that I couldn't control and didn't cause. That's just true. And I had to find a way to carry that without letting it harden me into someone I didn't want to be. Lena still calls me. Rochelle still meets me for dinner on Lakeshore. The maple outside my kitchen window in Port Hope turns red every October regardless of what else is happening. What I've come to believe is that the only real protection any of us has, against betrayal, against loss, against the specific cruelty of being publicly humiliated in your own driveway is having spent enough years building something genuinely yours, not yours as opposed to someone else's. Yours as in built with care, maintained with honesty, and grounded in enough self-respect that when someone tries to take it from you, there's actually something there to defend. He thought he was handing me an ending. It turned out to be the clearest morning I'd had in years.